So we did our accessibility audit on Martyrs Court, which is a freshman dorm building on the Fordham Rose Hill campus. So first we thought we'd start with defining access. Accessibility through the lens of the social model of disability provides the means for each student and other members to make sure they have an equal opportunity to utilize the campus and all of its facilities. So basically equal access for everyone. Even though there's no such thing as full equal accessibility, there's still guidelines there that we can put to make a definition. And so to ensure accessibility, every building on campus must be inclusive. As I said, experiences for those with disabilities cannot be universal. Everyone has different needs that must be met. There's not really one definition of accessible because of that. And therefore, disability is not a static, singular issue. So anything surrounding it should be adaptable and inclusive. So even given this audit right now and our guidelines right now, things could change in a few years. So everything constantly has to be able to adapt. Now let's talk about some barriers to access just to familiarize ourselves with them. We talked about physical, systematic, digital, and societal barriers. Physical barriers are obviously the ones we could see, they're visible right in front of us. A doorway not being wide enough to fit a wheelchair, a lack of elevators in a building. Systematic barriers are procedures or policies that are implemented on certain individuals that impede their ability to function in the wider society. Um, so they're discriminatory policies almost that target people, but almost find a loophole to get away with it. And then digital barriers are, websites that are inaccessible to people who might not have full vision, or the way something is laid out, the text, the font size, anything having to do with technology. And then societal barriers have to do with certain employers' insistence that a person with a disability doesn't qualify for a job due to the said disability.
So a little bit about Martyrs Court, the building that we audited. It is a freshman residence hall on Fordham's Rose Hill campus that was constructed in 1951, which is notable and should be remembered throughout this audit because it was constructed before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And it's divided into 3 halls. So there's Leland, Goupil, and Jogues. And there's about 500 students that live there in total across all 3 halls. And an overview of some of the basic features in Martyrs Court that we will get into later. It's made of primarily double and triple rooms, but there are some singles for like RAs, and the rooms are typically 11 by 16 feet. So there's 1 large lounge and 15 small community lounges and 17 study lounges, and then 1 kitchen and 15 kitchenettes. And there's also laundry on the basement level. So we'll get into how these worked in the access audit. And before getting into the actual audit, just a little bit about the guidelines that we used for it. We created our own checklist, drawing on guidelines from the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. And we also drew on these guidelines from the Do It checklist, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology. And it's called Equal Access, Universal Design of Housing and Residential Life. So we made this more applicable to the res life that we were looking at, and we audited 3 types of accessibility. So we did sensory, which is things like smells, lights, and noises, mobility, like wheelchair accessibility and sizing of spaces, and then psychological, like social interactions and impact of accessibility. So for the sensory access that we looked at, there were a lot of problems that were noted, but I think that just being a community space, it makes it difficult to control some of the specific sensory aspects in particular, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. So firstly, the visual access. The lighting everywhere in the building was fluorescent, and fluorescent lightings can be harmful, especially for people who have sensory sensitivity, like people with autism. And there have been studies that found a relationship between fluorescent lighting and increased repetitive behaviors for children with autism. So just to show that that actually can be a proven barrier with accessibility. And then the bedrooms do have blinds, but there aren't any dimmers, and residents don't have any control over lighting outside of their room or their bathroom. And these are common shared spaces, so it's not like they would have control over every light in the building, but it's not great that there aren't alternative light settings that would be less harsh. And then in terms of color, the residence halls require students to tap their IDs to get into the building, and entry access is indicated by a red or green light. So for those that are colorblind, differentiation might be difficult. And then the signage and access to Braille was inadequate. Bella will talk a little bit more about this, but it is an important visual aspect of accessibility, so I wanted to note it. And then one good thing, the alarms in the building had both a visual and auditory component, which makes it accessible to anyone that's deaf or hard of hearing, as well as visually impaired. And the acoustic accessibility of the building was not ideal. There is a constant buzzing sound that's happening, probably coming from the fluorescent light. And then also being a community space, there's a lot of different noises coming from a lot of different places. The dorm does have quiet hours from 11 p.m. to 9 a.m. and 1 a.m. to 9 a.m. on the weekends, but it's still difficult to control sounds coming from other residents' rooms. And during the day, there is no sort of monitoring for these sounds. And then there's also not very much echo in the building, which is good, but there is a little bit of echo in the stairwell. Yeah. So for the temperature access, luckily Martyrs Court actually has AC window units in each room, which is not the case in all of the dorms on Fordham's campus. Students do have control over the AC, but it gets removed in December and then reinstalled after spring break. So that's removing that component of accessibility for those who need it during times when it's not hot outside or they're not affected by the external temperatures, but they do need it indoors. And then the students also do not have control over heat in their rooms. So it can get kind of hot and they aren't able to change that at all. And then lastly, the olfactory components. There were several challenges, again, given that it was a community building. So there are a lot of strong smells coming from other residents, like in their rooms. There could be perfumes or other scents that are coming from there. And then also the kitchens and kitchenettes, they give off a lot of strong smells. They are on every floor, so it can fill up the halls with smells, especially if something is burnt or left out. And then there's also a very strong smell coming from the laundry room, which if you step into the stairwell, you can smell it immediately. And there are no air fresheners in the halls or lounges, so the Fordham itself did not put many olfactory things out there in the shared spaces, but there is scented soap. That was the only thing that was noted that they did put in the building that had a smell.
So now we're going to talk about mobility access in Martyrs Court. We'll start with the entrances. There's four entrances. There's multiple paths, different sides of the building. It's a very large building that you could enter. These paths, however, are quite uneven. It's a barrier for someone using a cane, a wheelchair, a scooter, any type of assistive device or technology. Even walking, I've tripped myself just walking over cracks and whatnot. Two of the entrances are double doors with no barrier in between, so those would qualify as accessible according to the ADA, which are the guidelines that we use. And these doors open manually, so they use a bar mechanism. So typically that is considered accessible, but oftentimes it depends on individual circumstances to really guarantee that for an individual. So these are images of some of the entrances. The one all the way on the left that says Goupil Hall is in the back of the building. That is not an accessible entrance. That one has 2 stairs going up to it, and it's a singular door with a handle, so it's not automatic at all. And a wheelchair user or any type of device user would have a very hard time getting in there. And when you enter that entrance, it goes straight into a stairwell. So even if you were able to get through that and get in, then you wouldn't be able to proceed into the building. The middle picture is the main entrance of Martyrs Court, called the Land Hall. That is an accessible entrance. There's a double door in that side, and then directly on the other side and around the back of the building is the other double door. It is accessible. However, when you enter, there's 2 doors on the left and the right side. One of them goes up to Leland Hall, and the other one goes to Goupil Hall. And those doors lead straight to stairwells as well. So you could get in the building accessibility wise, but then to actually enter the rooms and access other things, you would not be able to proceed again. And then the other entrance is Jogues Hall. And that entrance, you see there's a wheelchair ramp, looks accessible, but again, you walk in and there's stairwells. So unless you're on that very first floor, you cannot go anywhere if you have any sort of assistive device. Now we're going to talk about the stairs, the hallways, and the lounges. This building is overall just not accessible. There's 4 floors. There's no ramps, there's no elevators, there's no wheelchair lift anywhere in the building. So anyone with a disability should definitely not be living in this building. And the staircases are also very narrow. Regarding the hallways, they are not wheelchair accessible, and they're not wide enough according to accessibility standards put forward by the ADA. And there's also no handrails on them. And then the lounges, there's 1 lounge per floor, and the doorway of each of these lounges is not wide enough to meet ADA standards. So again, the building is just not accessible. Next, we'll see some pictures of this. You see the stairwells are pretty narrow. They have a lot of landings. The hallways are very narrow. You can't fit 2 people walking next to each other. And then the third picture, the hallway looks a little wider, but that's just one section of one of the dorms in Martyrs. So those are the hallways. Next, we'll talk about the bathrooms, the kitchen, and the laundry room. Firstly, there's inadequate signage in the building. So to get into these bathrooms, if you don't know what they are, or you need to see Braille, there's not Brailles on these signs. There's handwritten signs on some of the bathrooms labeling it men or women's. The bathrooms themselves are pretty small. The showers are very small and narrow, as well as the bathroom stall, although there is typically 1 handicap stall in almost each bathroom, and 1 handicap shower. But even so, if they're wide enough and large enough for a wheelchair user to access, there's no way for them to actually get into this bathroom because they can't get into the building with all the stairs. And there's no gender neutral bathrooms. Regarding the kitchen, residents have the ability to make anything, and there's nothing preventing cross-contamination for things such as allergies. So that could be an issue for people as well. And then the laundry room is in the basement, and you have to go down the stairs to access that as well. And there's tight, narrow spaces between each machine, so it's really hard to access that, even if you're a fully functioning, able-bodied person. Here's some photos. So the first one on the left is the sinks in the bathrooms in Martyrs Court. As you can see, it looks inaccessible, And then the second picture is the showers. They're very narrow, also inaccessible. Third one is the laundry room. You see how close the washers and the dryers are next to each other. And then the fourth one is the laundry room again, just to see the whole layout.
So now that we see that the mobility access in this building is completely inadequate, it's important to look at what Fordham says or does not say about the accessibility at Martyrs Court. So on the Fordham website, they have a list of all of the wheelchair accessible buildings that they have, and Martyrs is not listed on this given list that they have. And all of these buildings, not all of them are completely accessible, but they do include buildings that are somewhat accessible. So this is just saying that Martyrs is completely inaccessible. And the university is also aware of this, but they haven't done anything to change it. So it's possible that Fordham could point to this list and justify the fact that Martyrs is inaccessible by saying that they have these other alternatives that are offered and there are some freshman dorms that are accessible. But this just doesn't change the fact that one of the largest dorms on the campus, on Rose Hills campus, is completely inaccessible for students, regardless of whether or not they live there. So students who want to go visit their friends there would not be able to get into the building. And it just creates a big barrier on campus, regardless of whether or not there are alternatives that students can look to if they're trying to find a dorm.
So there are a lot of psychological accessibility issues that come along with Martyr's complete lack of physical accessibility. And we would hope that Fordham would not place individuals with certain disabilities into Martyr's Court as they physically cannot enter. Even if they're still living in another building, they can't go see their friends in Martyr's Court. And of course, most of these students are freshmen their first years, which is a really tough time in college period. And then adding this barrier for certain students just makes it that much harder. As well, family members or friends may not be able to visit certain students. Fordham likely doesn't know if a student's parents have a disability, and like we've touched on, disability is static and accessibility ability can change throughout time. And that's really important to note while living somewhere. And guards are likely not very accommodating and may give students a hard time. I think every Fordham student has their story about a guard kind of giving them a hard time. And even with the little extra time it may take a student to enter the building, they may face that frustration going into their own home every day. And this lack of accessibility can be isolating, frustrating, and cause various psychological difficulties for first year students, and therefore just another reason it needs to be addressed by the university. So we do have some recommendations. And of course, these changes are incredibly drastic and expensive, but they clearly need to be done. The building is definitely due for an upgrade. So um, ensure every entrance to the building is accessible, like Bella touched on, and you can see in the photos, most are not. And even if you can get into the building, you can't get to the rooms. It's important to install an elevator that reaches all 4 floors. There are absolutely no elevators in Martyrs Court, so that definitely needs to happen. Widen staircases and hallways, making it easier for everyone to get through, as well as expanding size of communal areas. Like you could see in the bathrooms and the laundry room, there really is little to no space to navigate, which makes it incredibly difficult. Widen doorways and install automatic buttons, once again, to make the building more physically accessible, and allow residents to have better control over lighting and temperature throughout the room, so they're much more comfortable while living there their first year at Fordham. We also wanted to touch briefly on tips for communication in a residence hall setting. As Martyrs is a Fordham residence hall, it's important to make sure everyone feels welcome and is communicated well with, considering it is their home their first year on Fordham's campus. And we thought these tips are critical for staff, such as guards and RAs, as well as other students, just to create a more inclusive community where everyone can feel really appreciated and accepted here at Fordham. And then we have a few more. So for students who may be blind or have lower vision ability, communicate everything aloud and be descriptive. Mobility impairments, considering having a conversation in a sitting position and just being observant about other people's needs and abilities. Speech impairments, it's important to listen very carefully and repeat words back, ask for clarification when necessary to ensure effective communication. If a student is deaf or hard of hearing, being sure to face them while they're speaking, avoid covering your mouth, chewing gum, or eating, speak clearly at a normal volume, maybe use a pen and paper if necessary or asked to do so. And it's important to speak directly to the individual, even if an interpreter is present. And learning disabilities, important to accommodate those and offer directions any way possible, especially written or orally. And so moving forward, of course, we ourselves can't make the building accessible, but we can urge students who are members of this community or have been members of the community in the past, such as the three of us, to let Fordham know that this building really does need to be updated. Students who need a building that is fully accessible should ensure they are not placed in Martyrs Court. And this is realistically the most a student can do in order to ensure their needs are met. And with all of this in mind, the burden to really fix this building should be placed on Fordham's leadership. They really need to make the necessary changes to ensure that Martyrs is accessible for all, and especially with the price we're paying to live here, it really should be truly accessible. And it's one of the major buildings on campus, as it's home to 500 students. So its current state is just completely unacceptable.
And overall, Martyrs was built in 1951, and hasn't been updated or renovated since. So any arguments regarding renovations of the building, disabled or not, should be seen as valid.
And here are our sources. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.